In a busy parliamentary week, changes to the NDIS stand out as the most consequential and contentious. Some in the disability sector are devastated. The Minister Bill Shorten says the reforms will save the scheme. He's our guest this morning. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. The government's to-do list is looking a little shorter after a productive week in Parliament. For all the bickering in question time, laws were passed, with Labor and the Coalition quietly negotiating behind the scenes. There's still plenty of unfinished business on aged care, gambling ads, political donations, superannuation in what's left of this term. But Labor is particularly satisfied at securing its reforms to the NDIS, which are aimed at reining in the growth of the scheme. Bill Shorten won over the states and territories, along with the Coalition. Some in the sector, though, are deeply anxious about what these changes will mean.
We're good to go, everyone?
Today. We're introducing it today.
Today, Labor has successfully passed legislation which will get the NDIS back on track.
Today, we've introduced a bill that will pay superannuation on paid parental leave.
Today, we finally see the legislation that would have some consequences for MPs.
Today, the Albanese government is going to be introducing new family law reforms.
Today, we expect the bill will be passed by the House of Representatives to take that next step forward to allow this administration process to begin.
We are getting things done.
In the People's House, Aged Care Minister Annika Wells crossing the floor for a front bench face-to-face.
The government is still yet to get an official sign-off from the opposition on a deal to reform aged care.
The legislation to fix aged care needs to get done as soon as possible.
We haven't yet settled a position with the government. Negotiations still continue.
Discussions have been constructive and, as far as I'm concerned, have reached a conclusion.
After months of hard-fought negotiations with the states and territories, finally a breakthrough.
The states and the federal government are getting their act together, and that people with disability and participants are not a political football.
Yeah, we remain concerned, absolutely concerned, that the Commonwealth may be simply passing the costs and the obligations associated with a scheme that they established back to the states.
I do remain concerned that we need to see further details.
There are challenges ahead that we're making very clear to the Commonwealth.
This bill passing the Parliament today represents the greatest betrayal of disabled people and our families in the history of this country.
It's probably the biggest day in the history of the NDIS.
There is heartbreak in the disability community today.
I know that there's been some in the disability sector who said it's the end of the world. They're wrong.
We are deeply committed to designing this with people with disabilities. Co-design is something that we have fostered, that we commit to, that we believe in.
It's a sad time when a government who has promised to co-design legislation with people with disability has turned their back on us.
And my guest this morning is the NDIS Minister Bill Shorten. First, let's check what's making news. Leah Finocchiaro has declared victory for the Country Liberal Party in the Northern Territory after a crushing win over Labor in yesterday's election. Chief Minister Eva Lawler was amongst those to lose her seat. Labor suffered swings of more than 10%, reduced from 14 to just 4 seats at the close of counting. The CLP is on track to win 15 seats. A handful remain too close to call. Meanwhile, in Tasmania, the future of the minority Liberal government has been thrown into doubt. It's supported in office by the Jackie Lambie network, but Jackie Lambie has just thrown 2 of her MPs out of the party. They'll now sit as independents. In the 9 newspapers, Beijing is preparing to host Treasurer Jim Chalmers for a visit as China's faltering steel sector threatens to punch a multi-billion-dollar hole in Australia's budget bottom line. The trip is likely to happen in coming weeks. It would be the first by an Australian Treasurer in 7 years. Matthew Knott also reports in the 9 papers that Australian officials are confident of locking in support for a Pacific-wide policing pact. aimed at preventing China from gaining a stronger security foothold in the region. The deal is set to be sealed at the Pacific Islands Forum in Tonga, which the Prime Minister will attend from Tuesday. Well, the NDIS reforms passed during the week are the scaffolding, according to Bill Shorten. The hard work on detail now comes to determine who will remain on the scheme and what they can access. But it's that detail NDIS participants are worried about, and the overall loss, they say, of choice and control. The Minister has won over the states and the federal parliament. He still needs to convince people with a disability why these changes are necessary. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Phil Curry, Karen Middleton and Claudia Long. Very good morning to all of you. So there's a lot in these changes and a lot of detail still to be worked through, but what they have agreed during the week, firstly with the states and territories, Phil, fair to say we saw a bit of it there. Not all the premiers are thrilled about it, but what have they signed up to?
Look, a couple of things. There's a few immediate, immediate savings measures, which I won't go into the details, but they're significant upfront savings. But more significantly, it serves like the framework to start changing the scheme because you're going to need the states. What happened when the NDIS was formed, David? It was supposed to be for people with a permanent or significant disability. It wasn't meant for kids with mild learning disorders, these foundational issues, so-called, that the states used to look after. And in this sort of rude haste to get the states signed up by both Labor and Liberal governments way back when, they said, give us everything you do and we'll pick up any blowout in funding. It was a terribly designed scheme. It blew out like billions, tens and hundreds of billions over the long term, more than it was ever going to cost. And so what this bill does is it allows Shorten to negotiate with the premiers to take back responsibility for those foundational supports, amongst other things. And they are one of the single biggest contributors to the cost blowout. So return the scheme to what it was originally envisaged to do. And of course the states don't want to do it because it's going to cost them a lot of money. But they did agree at a National Cabinet late last year, remember, in principle to do this, and the government gave them a ton of GST money, extra GST money to do this. So
and exactly how that's going to look. Yes, there've been work done behind the scenes, but we're yet to see exactly who's going to go into what, the NDIS or these foundational supports. What was most significant, Karen, do you think, on the changes that went through?
Well, they're capping the spending, and I think the most significant thing is that they don't have the community with them, and that it's created anxiety. And I think the issue here is that expectations have been raised. The scheme was lauded when it was first set up, as Phil said. It was a sort of all-in kind of idea, and people have got used to the idea that there is this whole all-encompassing safety net. So the problem they now face most primarily is in the lack of trust that the community has. And as Phil says, this is the sort of beginning now. They're saying they're going to negotiate. The disabilities community is concerned that the scaffolding wasn't negotiated with them, and the NDIS review said it should be, and now there will be negotiations about the eligibility detail, who will be eligible, who will not. But the whole thing is designed to rein in the cost. I think it's a $42 billion scheme, and there's concern that within a couple of years it could be out to $50 billion.
But it's not just this eligibility, kids with autism and developmental delays, Claudia, as to whether they still go into the NDIS or foundational supports. There's now this list, it's a draft list at the moment that was issued a few weeks ago, won't kick in till October, but it really spells out what can and can't be claimed under the NDIS, and that's creating some concern.
Yeah, because I think with the NDIS, it's really important to remember that obviously, there are 661,000, thank you, folks on it. It's actually a tiny minority of the disability community in this country, and disability is so individual to every particular person, so your needs are really individual, and the community, when we've talked with them and or many of us are part of it as well, this specific kind of list is it doesn't really cater to someone's very individual needs, because there's all sorts of stuff that you might need and it's very personal to you. And so obviously I think that's caused a lot of concern. It's also a very temporary measure, but the issue is that this bill, when it's signed into law, will then begin a 28-day transition period to these new rules, which is when these lists are going to come into effect. It's not clear, though, how long the transition period will last, because what it's going to rely on is the states, territories and Commonwealth negotiating a new definition of what constitutes an NDIS support. And so all of this, too, I think it's really important to note, comes after the government's response, not just federal but also state governments, to the Disability Royal Commission. And there was already such a colossal amount of disappointment with that. It was viewed as inadequate. And I think too, when we're talking about the NDIS, yes, it's a flawed system. It's also a system that has saved people's lives.
It's changed lives, there's no doubt about that.
100%.
And I won't come back to that Royal Commission point because I did talk to one of the Royal Commissioners during the week. But on the NDIS itself, the Greens have gone in really hard. They're suggesting the government's ripping services away. We did hear alongside Bill Shorten, though, from the NDIA chair, Kurt Fernley, really trying to give assurances to the community.
This has been a nervous time when you hear elements of your life discussed in Canberra. It can create a lot of anxiety. It wasn't that long ago that we didn't have an NDIS, and I think that, well, for me, we will never go back to that space, ever. The pathway forwards is with disabled people. We will not give up on co-designing this.
Yeah. Is that sort of assurance?
Yeah, he's spot on, but you can understand Kurt's, he's a good guy and he's right. But you can understand people have misgivings, and I'm talking about everyone knows someone who's got a kid on the NDIS who's with a severe disability. And it's been such a shocking scheme because, like each year you've had to reprove your disability. Oh, you're blind, but every year you've got to convince some bureaucrat you're still blind. It hasn't.
That's true, but the change it's made for them from
sure, but this whole scheme, this whole overhaul, and actually it would have been easy if they just scrapped it and started again. It had gone so far off the rails. So what they're trying to do is get it back for the permanently and significantly disabled for these people. But you can understand a lot of them have been so messed around on this scheme over the years, whilst on the other hand, so many people have ripped it off. There's some shocking behaviour. It's been the biggest pot of free government money in this nation's history. And those who it was designed for were exploited by it. They were suffocated in bureaucracy. It's about getting it right for them again and what it was meant to do. But you can understand, more change, more overhaul, the uncertainty and the fear that inculcates in people. Have had enough. Yep. And I think the job for the Minister and people like Kurt Fernley and others is to sort of reassure those people, you won't be disadvantaged by this. It's about getting it back to what it's meant to be.
The politics of this, Karen, the Coalition did try, when it was in government, to bring in independent assessments that Labor railed against.
Yeah.
They have largely backed, well, they did back in the Parliament these changes.
Eventually, yeah. So the politics are quite complicated. As you say, when the Coalition was in government and tried to make changes, Labor blocked them and criticised them. Some of those changes went a lot further than what they're doing now, but there was a bit of resentment on the Coalition side that they then had to come and support what Labor was trying to do when Labor didn't. But there are a couple of reasons they had to do that. One, Peter Dutton actually said in his budget reply speech, first budget reply speech in 2022, that they supported a sustainable NDIS and they would back the government. So they were in a bit of a bind. They couldn't block it really. They had to find a common ground. And equally, I think there's also a feeling that this has to happen one way or another, that the scheme's costs have to be reined in.
And better for the blowback to happen on Labor's watch, right?
They would rather Labor have to do it and get any opprobrium from the community and then it be fixed and in working order for whenever the Coalition gets back into office.
Just on the Disability Royal Commission, I mean, that was separate to the NDIS. This was looking more broadly at what needs to change. People might remember that there were 6 commissioners. They were split on whether to phase out special schools, segregated workplaces, group homes and so on. I did speak to one of the commissioners, Rhonda Galbally, for the podcast this week because the government responded to their commission a few weeks back and kind of was non-committal on a lot of that stuff. And look, former Commissioner Galbally didn't hide her disappointment.
There's a lot the Commonwealth needed to do, and for them to just almost, push it onto the states completely, I thought showed huge lack of leadership.
You can catch that full podcast with the QR codes there, but it's still unclear whether anything's going to happen on a lot of those measures.
Yeah, and a lot of them are, of course, to do with the states and territories in conjunction with the federal government. I think where the disappointment has really come from is that people had to relive and describe some of the most horrific treatment for that Royal Commission. It went for years, and to have then 10 months in this kind of response, which doesn't really actually lay out then further steps on how those recommendations that were accepted in principle, the vast majority were accepted in principle that pertain to the federal government. There was no timeline for how that in principle could then be moved to accepted. And I think, we've sort of been talking about this morning. When you have a community that is repeatedly let down over and over and over again. And yes, the NDIS has been a fantastic scheme and it has changed people's lives. It has saved their lives often. But for the many decades that wasn't in place, people were horrifically often mistreated, and a lot of those scars still linger. And it explains why there is this real distress and this real uncertainty around these changes. And look, I think what the former Commissioner just said there is an opinion that's shared by a lot of people in the disability community, frankly.
Well, time to now talk to the Minister for NDIS and Government Services, Bill Shorten. To take us there, here were two disability advocates who joined the Greens to condemn changes to the scheme.
This bill is about cutting support for people with disability. They're restricting our choice and control. People have got fewer choices in the plans that are coming up, and the devil is in the detail.
They just railroaded the bill through, and they've threatened lives of people like me. So imagine thousands and thousands of people like me are going to be institutionalised, forced from our own homes.
Bill Shorten, welcome to the program. Will NDIS participants have less choice and control under these changes?
No, not at all. Listen, I couldn't help but obviously listen to the analysis of the panel. There are 3 or 4 things which we've just got to get straight here from the outset. There are more people going to be on the scheme this week than there were last week. We will invest more in people with disability on the scheme this week than last week. What we're going to see with this legislation is returning the scheme to its original intent. The reality is that for 9 years before I became the Minister, people with disability were a secondary consideration in the NDIS. The scheme is changing lives. I mean, I guess, why on earth would your panel talk about good news? That's not what sells, but there's a lot of good news in this scheme. But the problem is, when I became Minister, I realised that things were far worse than could possibly be imagined. There are too many service providers who are rorting and overcharging. That's not the majority of service providers, but the reality is that there were some individuals making a lot of money out of the scheme, and outcomes and needs of people with disability were being ignored. But I do not agree that the few people you heard there represent the entire voice of all 661,000 people and their families and 400,000 people working in the industry. We have been working on this legislation and the case for it really since day one, 2.5 years ago. For as many people who say this legislation's rushed, other people say, why don't we just get on with stuff? So we had the biggest review talking to people with disability that we've ever seen. 10,000 people, thousands of submissions. I've done 18 town halls personally with tens of thousands of people present, both online. And what we want to do is make sure that the scheme is there for future generations, but we're also making sure that people know what they can spend their money on. I mean, the greatest fiction that I've heard is that somehow this government's invented a list of what you can spend your money on. There's always been a list.
Well, I'll come to that. There's always been a list of reasonable and necessary principles, not a list of what you can and can't specifically.
No, that's not right. No, that's not right, David. There's been operational guidelines in the agency.
Yeah, guidelines. Now we're talking about what you can and can't. Yeah, but it's not a specific list that articulates what you can and can't.
Let's clear it up right now. You practically, the problem with one of the problems for the NDIS is you practically need a PhD in its language. It's such a jargon-heavy issue. There's been operational guidelines saying what planners are allowed to give people and let them spend their money on what they're not. But the problem is those lists have been ignored sometimes, and so most people are doing the right thing.
You're not seriously saying those guidelines are the same as the list that you've now put out?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah, I am.
All right, well, this new list, it's a draft list at the moment.
Well, no, again, we're going to just correct the language here. It's a list which has the weight of a parliamentary regulation now. It's been an operational guideline, but, you know, the Greens have just caused more misinformation and anxiety raising. I mean, they've never seen a political challenge in Australia where they don't want to just cause anxiety. And I get that the disability sector does not want to go back. But this government had 3 options: scrap it, a la the Koori doctrine, do nothing, a la the Green doctrine, or just make it better outcomes for people with more clarity.
In fairness to Phil, I don't think he's saying scrap this.
No, I know that.
Just on the list, just to pick up on the list. So this new list now says that you can't, for example, claim for a washing machine or a dishwasher. Some of the participants are worried about that. They point out people with a disability often do need particularly specialised equipment. So Is it a guideline or is it a hard and fast rule? How will this work?
Well, the problem in the past is it's just been a guideline, so it's been interpreted differently by different people. When we give it the force of a regulation, it becomes easier to enforce. And
so it is going to be enforced
you use
in a
two
new
examples,
way.
washing machines and dishwashers. The Act says, and the Act has always said, that if services are provided by mainstream systems, it's not something the NDIS does. But in addition, what we've said is there are things which you can spend your supports on which are reasonable and necessary and give you choice and control. With household items, there are some household items which can be modified to make it easier for a person with a disability to use. They'll still be allowed. But this idea that, and I just want to clear up, that everyone can head down to Bingley or Harvey Norman and get yourself a washing machine on the scheme, that's not right, and that's never been
so,
right.
OK, to be clear, you can still apply for a particular washing machine.
It's in the substitute. Well, I don't know about washing machines and your particular disability, but what I do know is that if you have a particular need and the item is not on the list, but that there's a way which it supports you with your disability, well, then there'll be a substitution provision allowed. That's in the Act. There is more misinformation being peddled by the extremists. I mean, really, my challenge back to that, to the Green political party and the others causing this fear and misinformation is, your plan was to keep driving past the rorts. Your plan was to keep ignoring the lack of a payment system.
Well, let's talk about your plan, because the explanatory memorandum to your bill suggests there aren't special circumstances for things on this list. This morning, you're saying there are.
There's a substitution clause.
OK, so just to be clear for people, because a lot of people have raised these issues about the list, there's substitution clauses for everything on the list?
Well, there's a substitution clause, not for everything on the list, but for people's individual needs.
Right.
Like, again, but someone said, this legislation's been rushed. The legislation was presented on March the 29th.
But you made changes just the other day to it to get it through the Parliament.
Yes, but let's go to that issue of making changes. If we hadn't changed anything, we'd be accused of being arrogant. But somehow if we make changes, that's also, like, where's the fine line here? It's invisible to the naked eye. The reality is that we listen to the states and territories and we improve their co-governance protection.
Okay, but I just want to be clear on this. If there's someone who looks at that list, they're worried, there is a substitution clause, you're saying, that they can apply and say, I need that for my disability.
Based on individual circumstances.
And they can
what we're
still
not going to
get
do. Here's let me use a classic example. You might need a smartwatch because it sort of regulates your temperature. You've got a particular condition that, if your temperature starts really fluctuating, you're in trouble. That's fine. Come and talk to the agency about that. But we're not going to say everyone gets a smartwatch. And somewhere along the line, as we talk about change, I respect that people with disability are anxious. But we're budgeting going forward that this scheme will increase in cost. But there is a problem out there, and most people watching this show know it. Some service providers have been having a lend of it. There has been price inflation. And that's payment systems. We've now legislated for the first time a payment system. We haven't even had the ability to investigate invoices. And so we're seeing rorts. And
if someone wrongly buys something, claims something, they can now be issued with a debt. Is there the capacity to appeal against that?
Yeah. Like, first of all, there's always been provisions against people wrongly claiming. What we're actually doing is making sure that people know what they can claim and not claim beforehand. A trip to Japan is not allowed.
Sure, but the dishwasher or washing machine example, I get some of these, some of these examples are extreme. A trip to Japan.
Well, sorry, you're using examples one way. I guess I'm the one who sees. Do you know there's 400,000 transactions a day which we pay on the scheme?
The question was, if they're issued a debt, can they appeal that?
Yes, but what's more? No, but let's go further. The current Act wouldn't take into account one of the grounds for a waiver of the debt being a person's disability. We've put that in. So we're actually being a lot more realistic about the real world. But the truth of the matter is that we've seen what we call plans being exhausted prematurely. If you get a 2-year plan and all of a sudden a plan is exhausted in the first 5 weeks because some intermediary said spend your money, it'll be automatically topped up. My obligation is to everyone who's doing the right thing on the scheme. The dilemma with this reform is as simple as this. We just need to tell the truth. The truth is this scheme's very good. It's the best in the world, and we're investing more in people with disability.
The other
truth
concern
is also it's not working properly for some people, so we need better decision making. And there are rorts and shonks going on, and just because some people don't want me to talk about it, I will.
The other concern that's been raised this week is about the shift from unregistered to registered providers.
Yeah.
You know, some people say, look, I'm very comfortable with the person who comes and helps me get out of bed, shower, whatever it is. I don't want to go with a new person I don't know.
Sure. Well, we're not going to change that. But on the other hand, what's wrong with asking that everyone who's driving someone, that we see their driver's licence and that they've got car insurance? What's wrong with asking that if you're going to work with kids, that you've got to work in with children's check? In fact, what's wrong with asking, are you a real person and do you exist? I mean, the reality is that the Fraud Fusion Task Force, which I set up early in my piece, investigated the 900 of the smallest plan managers. These are people who manage people's plans. They gave the anonymised data to the Australian Tax Office. 343 or so came back, they've never declared any income. So we don't have a system in Australia where you can choose to have a driver's licence or not. The registration will be principles-based. We've released it. It's been commissioned by a human rights lawyer, commissioned by me using human rights lawyer Natalie Wade. It'll be light, medium and heavy. But if you're doing complicated tasks which go to people's safety, I want to make sure that the person doing it can actually do that job.
You've already made some savings through the crackdown on fraud and so on over the last financial year. I think $600 million was the latest figure of savings that you've found. You've got some new figures that'll come out a little later this week, I think. Will it be more than $600 million?
Yeah, I think the budget forecast for the scheme was $42.4 billion. I'm optimistic that just because we're running the scheme better and more transparently, we're eliminating some of that bloated waste. And so I'm optimistic it might even come in with a lower figure, a better figure than 600 million less than we foresaw. But before I start getting SMSs and trolled by a sort of very active minority, this is not a cut. The reality is that last year the scheme cost in the mid towards the $36 billion. It's still going to cost more this year. Under the Liberals in their last year, the scheme grew by 23% in cost and 15% more participants. What we've managed to do, even without this legislation, is the number of participants growing in the scheme's gone up by 8%, and the cost of the scheme's growth is still too high at 18%. We're just running the scheme better with better people.
But are you, I mean, the savings no doubt have come through some of those crackdowns, but...
Well, cost reductions, yeah.
The latest quarterly report also shows some sharp drops on performance. The number of plans approved on time fell from just over 50% to about 23%. The number of plan amendments done on time fell from 63 to 39%.
A simple explanation for that, David. What's happened is some of the people who have been living high on the hog, some of the service providers and some of the intermediaries, and there are very good providers, intermediaries, let me say, before they bomb me with their texts, the word's out. This is not going to be the easy ride that it once was with a lack of scrutiny. And so we've been flooded with a whole lot of variations and claims, which has increased the overall number by about 100%. So yes, what that means is that it's taking us longer to process them because we're getting a whole lot of extra claims because people realise that it's the end of the free drinks. And so that will invariably affect waiting times, but all of that will trend down in the next quarter.
All right. The foundational supports, we talked about those a little earlier. They're due to start July next year. Kids in particular with autism or developmental delays that don't end up on the NDIS. That's not far off, 10 months until they're due to start. Can you tell us what they're going to look like? Who's going to decide who goes onto what scheme? How far along are these plans?
Well, language is important, and some of the people who've been scaremongering obviously don't give a stuff about causing anxiety, but I'm not going to be one of them. So you said in that opening question that we're introducing foundational support so kids don't end up on the NDIS. At the moment...
No, I said for kids who don't end up on the NDIS.
Okay, sorry, I'm glad I clarified that then. So when your precious child has a non-standard developmental journey, at the moment, the option is sort of NDIS or nothing. What we want to do is build out a menu of support. See, one of the problems with the NDIS is it sort of pays for hours of individual service and families have been forgotten. So we want to, foundational supports might include, for example, building more peer-to-peer family supports. Nothing is better for a family with a child with a non-standard developmental journey than talking to another family who's been through the same thing.
So who's going to decide which one they go on?
Well, first of all, what we want to do is introduce lead practitioners where when you've got a question, often when you've got a new baby or a new family, who do you go to? At least for you know, in Australia we've had maternal and child health nurses for sort of some issues. So the reviews recommend that we develop lead practitioners so you can go to someone and just say, all right, this is my beautiful child, where do you recommend? Oh. But what we also need to do, other than just have navigators and lead practitioners who could be embedded in the community, then you need to know what their options are. Amanda Rishworth, my colleague, the Minister for Social Services, is working day in, day out with the states to develop a range of early intervention services outside the scheme, because not every child needs the full NDIS service. But my message to this is, I want to leave the politicians and the Greens and all the other sort of social media warriors out of the way. My message to parents is this: if your child needs the NDIS, you're going to get it. I've spent my whole 17 years in Parliament fighting for the NDIS, and the reason why perhaps I've sounded a little passionate today is I listen to the people who say do nothing, change is too hard. These people are dangerous, because if we don't do something about the cost growth, there will be no NDIS.
Okay, look, we could keep going on the NDIS, and we'll talk more about it, I'm sure, between now and the start of July. Just I want to get you on a few other things, if I can. In Parliament all week, the Coalition was pressing the government pretty hard on the visas issued to Palestinians fleeing Gaza. Could you just explain to us what the government's position is on supporters of Hamas? Do they pass the character test? Are you happy to see people who rhetorically support Hamas enter the country?
Well, I don't think Hamas is worth supporting, but people coming from Gaza, I don't know, I've never had the misfortune to live under a terrorist regime. I don't know, David, if you lived in Gaza and you had to do a survey when you might depend on your food, and the government does a survey and say, do you support Hamas? I don't know what you'd say, David, but you'd probably weigh up the interests of your family. The reality is the Hamas question is, I think, superseded by the way that governments of both sides have handled this issue, which is someone a security risk? The reality is that 7,100 visa applications have been rejected. Of the 2,900 or so which have been accepted, 1,300 people have come to Australia. We're just following the procedures and the rules which have been set in place. But let's go to the other point you said in the opening of your question. The opposition have been raising this. Do you know, since last Wednesday week ago, the 8th of August, the opposition's had the opportunity to ask 44 questions to hold the government to account. Do you know how many of the 44 questions have just been on these 1,300 people?
I think all of them.
44.
Yep.
And let's call out the deflection here. We've got a cost of living crisis in this country, and the opposition aren't dumb. They're pretty cunning.
I understand the political point you want to make here, but...
Well, then let me make it, because not everyone's as telepathic as you. The point is... They want to ask us questions on Gaza. The mob, the people out there, the citizens of Australia, they don't hear the opposition question. They just hear us answering questions on Gaza. So as a tactic, it's pretty cunning, but it's a low-rent, low-road path when people are struggling with their mortgages.
And finally, Labor's drubbing in the Northern Territory. The election yesterday saw them turfed out of office. Are there danger signs there for federal Labor, do you think?
Well, first of all, congratulations to the CLP. They campaigned well and have won the confidence of Territorians, so congratulations. Listen, you're a mug if you say there's never any federal implication, but in preparation for this question, I rang a lot of my friends in the Territory. They said it was a crime election. They said Labor got pincered, crime on the right, but on the left, the Greenies, the Zealots, the usual, you know, soapbox fanatics, they're all just, for them, it's only about fracking and nothing else. So in the Territory, they have big tides, big tidal movements. The tide goes out big, tide comes in big, and I'd say we saw a Territory political tide.
You got the federal election presumably early next year. You're recontesting?
It's my aim to keep fighting as long as I can on the causes which I want to.
That means running again?
Sure, at this stage, absolutely.
At this stage?
Well, David, I'm pretty sure the sun will come up tomorrow, and I'm pretty sure that on Monday, tomorrow, I'll be talking NDIS.
I'm sure you will. Bill Shorten, thanks very much for joining us. All right, we're going to look at, some of those reforms that are still to be done. Aged care is a big one coming up when Parliament does return in a couple of weeks. First, let's continue this conversation with Phil Curry, Karen Middleton and Claudia Long. Just on the NT election, it was, Bill Shorten's right. When the tide goes out, 8 years ago, it was the CLP who were crushed down to 2 seats. But for Labor last night, this was a pretty devastating result, Phil.
Yeah, it's never good to lose an election, and it was a pretty big loss. And, it's always a mug's game with state elections and territories elections, trying to extrapolate consequences. But look, it's just a bad time to be in government. I think if anything, it underscores that they're going to throw you out, and it's a very salient reason as to why Labor would never go before the Queensland election, which is in October 26, because we're expecting a similar result up there. And I think federally, they'll be hoping that the voters in the NT, where Labor has the 2 seats, Solomon and Lingiari, the 2 federal seats, have now vented on Labor up there for whatever reason, and will go easy on them. And this is the same philosophy underpinning the approach to Queensland. But it's I think I don't think they're as sort of unfussed, unworried by it as they're saying.
No, you've always got to keep an eye on those things, particularly as Bill Shorten says, getting squeezed on crime. You could insert national security, I suppose, for that at the federal level.
Pushes that button.
And
He
the
goes
Greens
up
on the left.
That button up there.
Aged care. Now, Karen, there was some expectation we'd see that done during the week. There have been a lot of negotiations behind the scenes between the government and the opposition trying to find bipartisanship on this one. It wasn't to be. Why? What's going on?
Oh, I think there will be in the end. I do think that.
Why the delay?
Well, again, I think there's been some, differences of view in the coalition about how to go about this and where the line should be. But equally, like with the NDIS, they had committed to reforming aged care.
Making it more sustainable.
Well, I mentioned Peter Dutton's 2022 budget reply, and in his 2023 budget reply, he talked about aged care and needing to be more sustainable and needing to support the government. So they've kind of boxed themselves in. So they're finding common ground on raising the amount you can pay over a lifetime, both in residential aged care and home care. But there's political complexities for both the major parties in this, because they both have constituents. If you want to be traditional about it, maybe the pensioners are the constituents for the Labor Party and self-funded retirees more constituents for the coalition. But all of them are going to be upset about having to pay more.
Yeah. Will the coalition backbench be nervous about those self-funded retirees? Or?
Yeah, there's anxiety, and I think this is what they reached an in-principle agreement last week. Labor made 3 quite significant concessions, but as Karen was saying...
Well, just on that, you wrote about this, Phil. One of them, Labor had promised, here's a reminder, Anthony Albanese, before the election, said they were going to get tough on dodgy providers with criminal penalties.
We'll introduce criminal penalties, including jail time, for aged care providers who seriously and repeatedly facilitate or cover up abuse and neglect.
And he's dropped that one now.
Well, that backfired because no one wanted to be a nursing home director anymore because, if you breach these standards and so forth, and then insurance costs went through the roof. So that was a non-negotiable by the coalition. They also, the lifetime caps, Labor, it's about 76, 77 grand now you can spend in entirety for your life on home or aged care, and they proposed 190 on residential, 0 on home care, and the Lib said nah. So they brought that down for both.
You do wonder, though, if there isn't a middle ground between the criminal penalties, which they've knocked out, and not much accountability at all, because clearly there needs to be accountability for the standards in some of these.
And a lot of this, Claudia, too, is about getting better standards. Yes, it's about saving the budget some money, making people pay a bit more, but it's lifting the standards, because we've seen time and again how terrible they can be.
Yeah, another Royal Commission. There's a lot of parallels here between aged care and the NDIS. There was another Royal Commission that showed just how badly people are mistreated, and I think Karen has a really good point. There has to be some kind of middle ground, because is that honestly the country that we want to live in and accept? Yeah. That kind of thing is appropriate? It was interesting too hearing Minister Shorten as well just then on the NDIS as well, and kind of, I guess, addressing some of those same issues. There's a lot of anxiety around this change. There's a lot of anxiety around the NDIS change, because these are systems that fundamentally support people to live their lives.
And in fact, he made a good point when he talked about not only the inflation of prices in that system, but also the issue around registration of providers. It's always astonished me that providers were not registered in that system. That's an accountability measure they're now trying to introduce. The same thing, really. I mean, obviously, nursing homes are accredited and there are standards, but there's clearly problems in nursing homes and residential aged care. The Royal Commission found it. There needs to be accountability.
The government's already done quite a bit of work on standards. You know, like care hours are up. You know, 24/7 nurses. 24/7. This argument is solely about sustainability funding. The NDIS, aged care, interest on debt, defence and whatever, health are the 5 top spending pressures on the budget, right? And it's the same philosophy. If we don't get this under control, we're not going to have an aged care system. Same with the NDIS. So this negotiation with the Libs is about that, and that's why there's bipartisanship. But at the same time, everyone's going to have to pay more. They're on a pension. I keep reading wealthy retirees. No, it's everyone apparently is going to have to.
Even the pensions will pay a little bit more.
At the moment, they can take 85% of your pension, and I've had experience with the aged care system. It's complicated if you don't understand it. If you've put parents through it, it's not that hard to understand, but so everyone's going to have to kick in a bit more, but it will be means tested, excluding the family home. So if you've got a whack of money in your super and this sort of stuff, you're probably going to have to chuck in more than, you will have to throw in more than someone on a pension. Okay. But it's about sustainability. But the Liberal backbenchers are nervous because it's self-funded retirees. They poked them in the eye in 2016 on superannuation. They protected them on franking credits. I think what Dutton is trying to do, he just wants to do it by the book. So wait till Parliament comes back in a fortnight, have a party room
meeting.
Make
sure his party room is on
Get the details signed off and not get ahead of it.
The CFMEU bill did go through, and then just days later, bam, the administrators were appointed. The speed of that took many by surprise, and I think 270 officials were shown the door promptly. And I think there's some talk of action, a walkout happening in the coming week from CFMEU members. But again, this was an area that both sides wanted to get done.
Yes, I mean, I think the coalition deliberately strung it out a bit, let the government roast a little bit longer, but in the end they did want this dealt with as well. It's hard to argue. You can't complain about the construction wing of the CFMEU and then not facilitate administration.
The National Secretary, Zach Smith, stays though. Why is that? Why? Right.
Well, it's interesting. I suppose that, they want union representation of that sector, and they've got somebody in place to manage the change. It's a hard job he's going to have, and he's not the only one who's staying, but there are only several of them that are, and I suppose they're thinking about managing that into the future. So there's union representation and somebody overseeing the restructure and the clean out.
The gambling ad reform is still to come as well, and interestingly, Claudia, we saw on Friday afternoon what was called the rapid review of domestic violence responses handed to the government, made public. You've got a handy copy right there. And it points to
Here's one I prepared
It points to gambling ads.
Indeed
as
it does,
well.
and I've put a note down here because I think it's a really interesting recommendation. It says, and there'll be a few people in the government who perhaps it's not come at a great time for them politically.
Because they basically said no to a complete ban.
They've essentially said no to a complete ban, which is what is recommended here. And they've actually quoted, this panel has quoted Peter Murphy, the late MP who led that inquiry into gambling advertising. And they've quoted her where she said, "We have a culture where sport and gambling are intrinsically linked. These behaviours are causing increasingly widespread and serious harm to individuals, families and communities." They've said that there is evidence that clearly shows that where gambling coexists with domestic, sexual and family violence, it often escalates its severity. And they've recommended that the government essentially move to an all-out gambling advertising ban. There's also stuff in here about alcohol and needing to reduce alcohol advertising and also alcohol delivery hours as well, because alcohol is also a factor that exacerbates violence against women and kids. And so, we've got this growing pile of evidence.
But I don't think that's going to shift.
Well, no, indeed, because it's tricky, because then you have, a government that's commissioned a number of reviews. You've had evidence presented to previous governments, and it seems to all point in the same direction, which is that they are recommending that this is what the government do. The government is having to balance a lot of other factors that I know Phil's going to talk about in a sec. But how do you continue turning down the reviews that you commissioned? I'm not sure.
The media companies have made a pretty strong case, though, to the government, haven't they? And that seems to have convinced them to stop short of a full ban. Yeah. They'll implement restrictions.
Yeah, I've got to declare an interest. I'm paid by Channel 9 ultimately, yeah. So as a company we benefit from gambling ads, but so a personal view I don't have. But it is interesting, these calls to ban. We at the AFR, we had our monthly poll. We tested this question And I know in the Insiders last week you had should you ban gambling ads or not, and it was 53.
It was just over 50% said completely.
But if you do ask that question, you do get a small majority. But if you actually present voters with options, there isn't majority support for a complete ban.
Right.
And we, through the Freshwater AFR poll, we just said complete ban versus roughly what the government's proposing. I think 2 ads per hour, nothing, in kids' TV and during either side of a sporting event and stuff, and that had much higher level of support. So it's interesting. You've got these reports and that saying ban it, but when you present people with options, not everyone's a prohibitionist out there. They support the Shorten doctrine.
What is clear is there's a high level of irritation at being bombarded by gambling ads, particularly during sports broadcasts, but all the time.
I think it's pretty safe to say there's going to be change. I'm also impressed with the number of tabs that you've got in that report there, Claudia.
I mean, I think it raises a really interesting question as well, which is what do we value the most when it comes to ad money and when it comes to the impact that this can have, and how are we going to prioritise it and balance it, and how urgently is that going to happen? I think that's the most interesting question, is how urgently are we going to see a partial ban rolled out or a full ban or whatever it ends up being, just something that responds to this and, the body of evidence, frankly, that points to this being a problem.
All right. Parliamentary standards, again, an area where I think we probably will see agreement, because there was a cross-party group that worked on all of this before the government this week announced its plans for this new commission, which will deal with serious misconduct, things like bullying, sexual harassment and so on, in the parliamentary workplace. This was a recommendation of Kate Jenkins in the review that she did. Look, it won't, however, police behaviour in the parliamentary chamber, and this is something the Teal independent MPs are a bit concerned about. They're increasingly expressing their concern about the behaviour that we're seeing in question time.
The shouting, the mocking, the name-calling.
We know, and we're hearing often, that there is an issue about violence against women, and it starts with role modelling.
Overwhelmingly, the conduct is by male MPs.
Karen, is it realistic that you would have an independent commission overseeing behaviour in the chamber?
It gets more difficult because there's a parliamentary privilege thing that attaches to behaviour in the chamber and commentary in the chamber. But it is a legitimate question, what gets said when the mics are off, what gets said just loud enough for the person next to you to hear but not loud enough for the Speaker or the President and the Senate to hear. There is intimidatory sometimes behaviour that goes on. And
occasionally there are appalling things said.
Yes.
But I think generally what they're talking about is the rowdiness.
Well, they're talking about the general culture in the building, and that's something that everybody's raised in the going right back to when Kate Jenkins' Set the Standard report came out. We've talked about this issue for years, and it remains a cultural problem that this is the way politics is practiced in this country in a robust way. We want a robust democracy, but does it have to include some of the behaviours that those women were just talking about? And is there a different way to do it? Without a structural change, maybe it doesn't change at all, but it is extremely difficult to police in that hard and fast way behaviour in there.
It'd be utterly unworkable.
Well, this is the question. How do you do it?
Just strengthen the standing orders. That's what they're for, right? I mean, you can get bulleted for an hour, you can go out for 24 hours, or there's bigger suspensions for worse behaviour. There's, you have to withdraw unparliamentary remarks, things like. There's already a sort of a fairly solid framework rules, but no, you could toughen those. But to have some independent authority sitting there when they're all doing this, imagine it. It'd be just.
No, that's right. But it is.
Like
it's
the
a
VAR.
question of what the referees actually hear in the chambers and what they don't hear.
Yeah, Claudia?
And also, I mean, every time we're sitting in QT, I think about the
question time.
Yes, question time. Sorry, thank you. Every time we're sitting in question time, I think about the parliamentary inquiry into conduct during question time that happened a few years ago now, that recommended an end to Dorothy Dix's better conduct in the chamber, and neither party have chosen to follow it up and implement it. So personally, I don't have a whole lot of hope for conduct in the chamber.
Regular pledges.
I just think, I mean, there's never a place for bullying or abuse or anything like that, but you've got to let it go in there sometimes. It is a combative workplace. It is not I know it's Allegra Spencer and others saying, I've never worked in a place like this. That's because there is no other workplace like that. It's where two tribes come to work every day and attack each other, and it's always going to have an element.
This tension between the Teals and the Coalition, I mean, the Coalition is the Teals' main political enemy, I suppose. But this tension does seem to be growing. Peter Dutton also hitting back at them, and they're talking about targeting the Teals more. And he offered this on the Today Show on Friday, a pledge, and bookmark this one, a pledge not to form a minority government with those green Teals, as he calls them.
There is no way in the world that these Teals will support a Liberal government, and the Green Teals we will not enter into government with.
There you go. We'll see at the moment a hung parliament is declared, if that happens on election night, whether that holds. Look, Peter Dutton, for his part, spent the entire week, as Bill Shorten mentioned, on the visas issued to Palestinians fleeing Gaza. Karen, smart move, or did they ignore the stuff they should have been talking about?
Oh, I think they should be also talking about the cost of living, but they have stolen all the oxygen from the government in trying to talk about the cost of living. I think that was a politically driven move when they raised it initially, but they had some success with it because, the coalition were using some loose language talking about tourist visas when they were never tourist visas. They were visitor visas, which are only issued to people with family connections and means that people are able to be traced a lot easier than with tourist visas. But on the government side, they keep on talking about ASIO being involved at all stages, which is just not right. There's an initial assessment done against a watch list. If people aren't on the watch list, they're not automatically being assessed by ASIO. So everybody's been a little bit gilding the lily in all this. And I think the more they went on, in fact, they probably got a little bit more out of the government because the government was wrong-footed on this. So they kept on going. So in the end, it became a large political mess. But there were some questions raised around the processes, and it isn't clear to me why the government didn't use a special humanitarian visa, what they call a 449 visa that was used in some other emergency situations, that they went straight to the visitor visa.
It appears to have been something of an incremental thing. People started applying to come out, family members here were helping them on visitor visas, and then suddenly you've got a whole bunch of them here. Phil, did the opposition get very far though?
Oh, look, who knows? But obviously they felt it was working for them because they did every question this week on it, I think. So they must have thought it was working to their advantage. I mean, national security, the next election, the top three issues will be cost of living, cost of living, cost of living. But national security is always a big one, and I assume they think they're burnishing their credentials on that and damaging the governments. That would seem to suggest.
Yeah, I guess the question is, does Peter Dutton need to keep showing that's his
He's
strength?
also prosecuting the I'm strong and you're weak argument, and this plays into that, as well as being, as Phil says, on national security, which the coalition sees as traditionally their turf, which means the debate is not on the areas and issues that the government wants.
Yeah, all right. Our panel, Claudia Long, Karen Middleton, Phil Curry, will be back shortly with some final observations. Time now, though, for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer-at-large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with cartoonist for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, Cathy Wilcox. Very warm welcome back, Cathy.
Good morning, Mike. Good to be here.
Cathy, Peter Dutton's brought an overseas conflict very close to home as he continues to oppose Gazan refugees.
Oh, I think he's trying to keep the conflict a long way away, if at all possible.
Lovely Matt Golding cartoon who's illustrated perfectly, I think, the hot Dutton topic. In case of no one breaking glass, break glass. Dutton's political strategy.
Yes, there's not a controversy, so we better fill that void.
Stir that pot. I thought David Pope was particularly poignant with this one, no leg up for terrorism.
But what if one day one of them uses it to walk with Hamas?
Yeah, putting the pro in prosthetic.
Dutton's trying to get everybody to see the Palestinians as one group, and David Pope is very successful at bringing it back to the idea that these are actually individuals and they need to be understood in terms of their particular circumstances.
Brett Lethbridge, duck and cover, he's got Anthony Albanese hiding under the table.
Remaining as small a target as possible.
Yeah. Ceasefire! I thought that Megan Herbert summed it up quite beautifully. Refugees in Gaza here surrounded by all this displacement, orphanhood, death, amputation, injury, malnutrition, lack of medical supplies.
Lack of sanitation, disease, exhaustion, trauma, and guess what? There's a new monster on the block, and that's polio, that's right, as if they didn't need something more.
Cathy, they say that politics is the art of the possible, but recently it seems like it's the art of what you can get away with.
Yes, it's not only the standard you walk past, it's the standard you crawl under.
Andrew Dyson has got, this is a fairly big task for this parliament here to get over. They might have to lower the bar a little. Matt Golding, I think it's getting close to their milk, apple and nap time as the sook word. The S word has been thrown about a bit recently. Yeah. See, I think sook is a very Australian
sook is
word.
perfectly fine.
Perfectly fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
I thought Fiona Katowska's cartoon was particularly good. She's obviously spent a bit of time because she's got all the perpetrators here. Barnaby Joyce and Susan Lee and Ted O'Brien, Tony Passon and Fletcher.
Here's the child going, now I know what I want to be when I don't grow up.
Yeah, when
lovely,
I don't grow
lovely
up.
line.
I often look up at the kids in the gallery sort of observing this and think, what must they
Did you wave at them and go, don't be like that?
No. Glenn Lelever has condensed this down to its purest form, which is Parliament as a flock of seagulls fighting over the chip, which is Australia and Tasmania. I like the fact he's included Tasmania. Tasmania would be the scallop.
He always includes Tasmania and poor hapless Australia as this poor chip and all these seagulls in the like the seagulls in Nemo going moint, moint, moint.
Cathy, the Liberal Party seems to be in a terrible state, and that state is New South Wales.
This is a parenting situation, Mike. Your kid had to get their form in to be able to go on the camp.
Yeah.
But they come to you crying because they didn't get their form in. Here we are. We have a collective noun. Entitlement of Liberals. It's the New South Wales Electoral Commission. Now look here, this isn't good enough. You tell your manager, my people are not going to put up with this. And they're having a little cry about having missed out on being registered.
It's been wonderful watching that. It was his fault. Alan Moyer has suggested that perhaps the Libs in New South Wales have learnt from the great Donald Trump.
If you don't get your own way, have a good tanty or a sook.
Well, I'll just sit here quietly and have a tanty and I'll let you do the honours.
Okay, back to you, David.
Thank you, Cathy. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Claudia.
So last week we saw the Senate inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women hand down its report that was, a real indictment on the crisis, really, that this nation is facing in regards to that. And it called for more representation within the Domestic, Sexual and Family Violence Commission for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And there's growing calls for a standalone Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander Family Violence Commissioner. It'd be interesting to see if the Commission chooses to appoint such a person.
We will see. Karen.
This week we saw the valedictory speeches from ministers who are retiring, who stepped down ahead of that reshuffle. A little bit unusual to have them so quickly.
Pretty early valedictories.
Government is describing them as ministerial valedictories, special language. You do want, and saying they'll have the opportunity to speak again at the end of the year, but you do wonder whether they're just making sure they got the chance and leaving the option open to call an election before the end of the year. I still don't know that there's a lot to recommend doing that for the government, but the option is there. They've had the chance to speak. They may not get another one. We'll see.
Yeah, take your chance when it's there. Phil.
Look, this week, Graham Perrott, who holds the Brisbane seat of Moreton, announced he wasn't running again. He's been under pressure not to run. Graham says it is his choice, but there's been some deal for a long time that he'd be replaced by a female candidate, but he said he's going of his own accord. He's a good bloke, Graham, but he's actually a very good local member. He held that seat against the tsunami in 2013, which nearly wiped Labor out in Queensland. They only have 5 seats in Queensland, and the Greens are having a red-hot go at Moreton. If they were to win that seat and Labor were to pick no other seats up in Queensland, both Labor and the Greens would have the same amount of seats in Queensland. That's the state that once gave us Kevin Rudd and 15 Labor seats, they'd be down to 4 each. So there's a few people nervous about the departure of Graham Perrott from Moreton.
Yes, I expect we'll see Labor spending a fair bit of time in Queensland between now and the election, whenever that is. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Finally, while the Democrats in the US were bursting with excitement at their convention in Chicago all week, Republican vice presidential candidate JD Vance was struggling to generate much excitement at all as he tried out some grassroots campaigning in a donut shop. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
I'm sorry, man. Okay, yeah. She doesn't want to be on film, guys, so just cut her out of anything. Appreciate that, man. I'm JD Vance, American Vice President of Tennessee.
Okay.
We're going to do 2 dozen.
Okay.
Yep. And just a random assortment of stuff here. How long have you worked here?
I've been here since the beginning of July.
Okay.
For this year.
Okay, good. How about you, sir?
Almost 2 years.
Okay, good. How long is it?
Everything?
Just everything, yeah. I mean, a lot of glazed here, some sprinkle stuff, some of these cinnamon rolls.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.